Hello, welcome in. Today I am doing part 2 of the books that I have been reading recently. The first book that I want to talk about today is Monster She Wrote. This was so good. This is about the women writers who have been pioneers in the genres of like horror and sci-fi and speculative fiction, which of course I was super excited about, but this book ended up being really different than what I was expecting, so I still loved it. But I do want to clarify that in case anybody else is going into it with like similar expectations. So the book says that it is part biography, part reading guide. And I thought that we were going to get like a few women authors that we did like a kind of deeper dive biography on, learning a lot about their life. I thought the reading guide was going to be like, I don't know, book discussion type questions or discussions, things to think about when you're reading this book, little mini essays of some kind, you know what I mean? And I thought that we would get that kind of like a deeper context for a few authors, but this book is not that. This book is actually, I would say, more like a list of recommendations, and we get a lot of recommendations, like hundreds and hundreds of recommendations, but it doesn't really go into depth on any of them. You get maybe a paragraph about the author and then a paragraph about each book, which again, when I first started, I thought that I was going to be really disappointed by that, but I actually ended up really liking it because I got so many recommendations for authors that I had never heard of or books that I have never heard of that all sound so interesting. And obviously you know that I love like horror and gothic and stuff like that, and there are so many books on my TBR now that I would have never known about otherwise. I feel like I know about so many hidden gems now, you know what I mean? And I'm really excited to read them. So honestly, I was completely happy that that was what this book ended up being. And speaking of creepy gothic books by women writers, I have also read recently, for the very first time in my life, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I don't know how I, of all people, made it 32 years without reading this, but I'm really glad that I've read it now. This book was written in like the 1800s in the English countryside, but not like Jane Austen countryside. Picture like a more gloomy gothic setting, right? And it follows basically these two children named Heathcliff and Catherine. Heathcliff has been adopted into Catherine's like wealthy family, and they grow up together. They have this really intense bond. Heathcliff is very mistreated by Catherine's family. Catherine ends up marrying this other guy who's from a wealthy family, but then something happens where Heathcliff ends up inheriting the estate, and he's basically now the lord of this estate, and he decides to use that power to seek his revenge. Not only that, but also like tormenting the next generation of like innocent children. Like his feud is following the bloodline. He's now after Catherine's children. Heathcliff doesn't care. He's mad at everyone. The book is just this really dark roller coaster of all of the tragic, bad, scary, horrible things that are going on in these families, and I really liked it. Obviously, I loved this. This was so good. This is like right up my alley. It's the kind of book that I would love to write an essay on. I would love to read this in class. I loved it. And it was also like really entertaining because there's always some like new scandalous thing or like horrifying thing. So I really, really did enjoy it. But there's one thing that is just really bothering me about it. And that is that after I read it, of course, I was really interested. So I went online. I want to see what other people are saying. I went to look up some like academic articles and see what the critical conversation around this book is. And people really like Heathcliff. Even, and again, not just like casual readers, but like academic texts and stuff are like discussing Heathcliff as a man that's like, yeah, he's doing some bad things, but you can really sympathize with him because people were mean to him first, and like, you're kind of on his side. But ma'am, that's an entire villain. Like, that's a villain. Because you know I love a good like morally gray anti-hero. Like, show me an enemy and I will show you the love interest of the story, right? Like, but this was not, ma'am. I could not. I wish that I had never seen that. I pretend I do not see it. Anyways, I also read a more modern kind of gothic inspired book called Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. I really liked it. I was drawn to it because it is basically a gothic storyline, but gender bent, in that the typical roles of the gothic storyline are reversed. We have a innocent, naive, romantic, optimistic man who marries like a dark, mysterious, wealthy woman with a lot of secrets and an old family estate. And she is the one that's like, yeah, we can get married and I'll love you and we'll have a very happy, wealthy life together. But the one condition is that you never pry into my past or try to know my secrets. And of course he does. We love to see it. I thought that the writing was beautiful. It was decadent and it was infused with like fairy tale vibes as well. So it was your typical Gothic story, but with this like magical fairy tale sheen. I loved it. I thought it was great. And I also listened to this on Libro FM, which I talk about it every time, but you know, I'm going to again. Basically, when you purchase an audiobook on Libro FM, you can choose to have that purchase go through and support whatever bookstore you choose. It could be a local bookstore, like a family-owned bookstore, instead of giving money to Jeff Bezos, who we do not like. So, and I do actually have several other audiobooks that I want to talk about that I listened to on audio. The first one is Wayward by Amelia Hart. Yeah, this definitely went straight onto my TBR purely because of the cover. Look at that. But basically it follows the story of 3 women living in 3 different time periods, and I believe they're related, like they're descendants of each other. The first one is set in the present day. A woman named Kate is fleeing from an abusive boyfriend, and she is going to hide out at this cottage that she inherited from her wacky great aunt who she never even met, that's out in the middle of the English countryside, and hopefully her boyfriend won't be able to find her there. The second one we follow is set in 1942, and I believe it's the wacky great aunt, but I could be wrong, but they are definitely related, I think. But anyways, she is a young girl growing up. Her family is pretty wealthy. They have this estate, and there's just a lot of expectations on her to be a proper young lady in the 40s. And then the last one that we follow is in the 1600s. A young girl, her mother is like a healer, apothecary. She knows herbs and potions and stuff. And so of course, she's accused of witchcraft. And because her mother was accused of witchcraft, of course everybody thinks that she's a witch too, and she's dealing with that, like being outcast from society and being constantly threatened. And I think a big theme that runs through all 3 storylines that the whole book is really about is kind of like the things that society does to women, and like all of the bad, really messed up stuff that women have to endure and how they get through it, their connections to each other, and also like this really powerful connection with nature, which I really liked. I'm a big nature person, so I appreciated that. However, I don't know if any of the things that this book really touched on were particularly empowering or even really good. I actually could see a lot of ways that this book could be interpreted as being kind of backwards and kind of regressive. A lot of emphasis is put on the idea of reproduction. Again, this kind of like whimsical connection to nature. It feels very like, as much as I love it, I'll also be the first person to admit that that does have some connotations as well that's a little still. I did enjoy this book. I thought that it was really beautiful. It was really, really atmospheric. I loved the characters. I think that they're really likable characters that you root for and you really hope for the best for them. So I did enjoy it. Maybe it does have some questionable issues. Not sure, having kind of mixed feelings. I also listened to The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. I will be honest, I put this book on my TBR because I kept having to shelve it at the library, and the cover looks so good, and then the synopsis was really good. It's basically about this group of people who are making a documentary about this old abandoned mining village, I think in like Sweden or something, that in the 1950s everyone disappeared. They vanished without a trace. No one's ever found them. The only people left in the city were a woman who had been stoned to death in the middle of the town, and then a newborn baby that was left in the nurse's office. And that's it. No one's ever seen anyone else from this village ever again. So the main character wants to make a documentary about this, and she gets there and a bunch of weird stuff starts happening. Saying all of this, it sounds so good. This sounds like something that I would love. It would be a great time for me personally. But I don't know, it just didn't really do much for me. Something about the way the story was told, it wasn't really that intriguing. The characters weren't really interesting to me. The creepy things that were happening were like, oh yeah, that's kind of creepy. Some of the tropes I didn't really enjoy how they were used. Like there's some mental illness tropes. There's a character who is schizophrenic and it's part of the like scary things that are going on in the story. Like I just don't know if I liked how that was done. I don't know. It just didn't do much for me as a book. But another audiobook that I listened to was Against the Current by Olivia Matthews, and I did really enjoy this. This is a cozy bakery themed mystery about our main character Lindsay, who opens a new Caribbean themed bakery. This bakery sounds amazing, and the book even comes with like some of the recipes for some of the like Caribbean style baked goods that they sell at their bakery, and they sound really good. But when Lindsay opens this bakery, another local bakery owner, this guy that no one really likes because he's really grumpy, comes in, says she shouldn't open a bakery because this is his turf or whatever, and Lindsay and him get in a very public argument. And then the next day, he is found murdered. So of course Lindsay is the prime suspect, and of course the police are really bad at their jobs and they're not investigating anything that would clear her name. So Lindsay has to do it herself and find out who murdered this man so that she can prove that it wasn't her. I really enjoyed this. Honestly, I don't think mysteries are really my type of thing, but this was really fun and really cute and I enjoyed it, and I thought the audiobook was really good as well. I also listened to the audiobook for Fourth Wing, which has been going around. Everyone has been reading this. I wasn't really gonna read it, but my friends were all reading it, so I was like, okay, fine. This is a fantasy story about a girl who has spent her entire life planning on becoming a scribe when she grows up, and that's her career path, working in the library with books. But she ends up being forced to join the Dragon Riders quadrant of the military instead. That's not her thing. She's not cut out for that, but she has to do it and she has to find a way to survive. I had a lot of fun reading this. This is just like a really fun fantasy story. A lot of people have been saying that this book gave them like the same sense of excitement and like joy to read as, you know, back in the olden days when we were all reading like The Hunger Games and Divergent and stuff like that, which I can definitely see. I think that it was really a fun and intriguing plot line. The characters are like interesting. I think that it's easy to like get absorbed into the world and just be excited about what's going on with the dragons and all of this. There's a really good enemies to lovers romance going on that I really enjoyed, but I also have seen a lot of bad reviews for this book as well, which I also understand. Like there's a lot of times that it was kind of tropey in a bad way and like kind of cringy, like secondhand embarrassment for the writing style, to be honest. I see both sides, and I think my experience reading it was a bit of both. I think that for me personally, this isn't a book that I would have picked up by myself of my own choice, but because my friends were reading it and like everyone was reading it, there is something so powerful to be said about like a group experience and like reading a book that other people are reading and excited about, and especially with your friends. Like me and my best friends read this book around the same time, and whenever some like plot twist happened or some character did something horrible, we could text each other, and like that is such a good time. So I had a very positive reading experience with Fourth Wing. And speaking of reading books with my friends, I also have some books that I read for our little kind of like buddy read book club situation. First of all, we read together How to Sell a House by Grady Hendrix, which I was really excited about because I love Grady Hendrix. I love the way that he approaches the horror genre, and I think that what he puts into his books is exactly what the genre should be. His books always remind me of like campy horror movies that have a really solid, good heart underneath. And this book was also just like that. It's basically about a woman who both of her parents die, and so she has to go with her brother, who she does not get along with at all, to her parents' old house and kind of work through the affairs dealing with their death and their will and everything like that. And one of the things that makes this so challenging is that her mom was pretty much like a hoarder of creepy dolls and creepy puppets. So you can see where the horror elements start to come in. There's this one puppet in particular. Both of the kids had like experiences with in their childhood and now starts wreaking havoc in their adulthood. Like I said, it just reminds me of like old crappy horror movies, which I love. Yeah, like it wasn't my favorite Grady Hendrix book. I think that it did kind of fall flat compared to some of his other ones for me, but I still liked it and I still enjoyed it. Then we also read The Witch and the Vampire, which is supposed to be like a sapphic retelling of Rapunzel, which sounded really good. I was really excited. Basically, the premise is that There are these two girls that grew up together. They were best friends, and they live in this fantasy world where there are witches, and the witches have to hunt vampires. And then one of the girls gets turned into a vampire, and the other one is still a witch. And this friend thinks, for some reason, I'll be honest, it was kind of a reach, in my opinion, but she thinks that this friend murdered her mom. So they're enemies now, or at least this girl thinks they're enemies. This girl doesn't really have any idea what's going on, and to be fair, neither did I. But they end up being kind of forced into this situation where they have to work together and travel together through the dangerous forest to another city. And of course, during that time, they have to kind of work through and reconcile their differences. Again, it was fine. I don't have any like specific complaints. I thought that the world sounded like a really cool world and like fantasy situation, but it wasn't really built. Yeah, the plot was kind of slow. The girls, I don't know what was going on between them, did not make any sense to me. So overall, it was fine. It wasn't a bad book, but it's not one I don't think I'm gonna read the sequel. Then the last book that we read together was The Only One Left by Riley Sager, and you know how I feel about this man. And as usual, this book had a very cool premise. Riley Sager has very cool premises for his books. This one is set in this crumbling old mansion that used to be a really wealthy home of a family from like the 20s. Basically, the whole family got murdered except for one daughter who everybody is pretty sure did it, but they could never prove it. And it's kind of like this Lizzie Borden style thing where like there's a rhyme that goes around about how Lenora Hope took a rope and hung her sister or whatever. Lenora Hope is now an old disabled woman who needs a caretaker in her mansion, and our main character is a caregiver who has been assigned by her boss against her will the job. Yeah, that's the setup. Again, sounds like a great premise, and honestly, I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly offended by this book. I actually don't have anything from this book that made me feel like ragey or complainy or ranty. Like, it was a pretty cool story. The mystery played out pretty well. There were some pretty cool plot twists, although there were some cool plot twists. But there were also 5,000 of them on the space of like 5 pages. Like, Riley Sager truly was like, what is every plot twist that I could think of? Put them all in a hat. And then instead of drawing a handful, he dumped the whole hat out onto the book and said, we'll use all of them. And some of them were just really weird and really like unnecessary and didn't do anything actually for the story. They were just there to be like, okay, I guess. But that being said, one of my main issues with Riley Sager is that the way he writes women, you clearly think that women are idiots. You clearly think that we're stupid. We don't know how to take care of ourselves. And I will say that in this book, she wasn't that bad. It wasn't the worst Riley Sager book that I've ever read, and I'm willing to admit that, but I still don't like him. He's still on thin ice with me. But to end this video on a more positive note, I wanted to talk about a book last that I really loved and that I thought was really beautiful. And that was The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I put this on my TBR as soon as I read his other book, Between the World and Me, because I just thought his writing was so beautiful and emotional and touching. Between the World and Me, it was like a nonfiction, kind of a letter from him to his son. But The Water Dancer is a fiction. Not only is it a fiction, but it's almost like a fantasy. It is set during American slavery, and the main character, Hiram, is trying to escape, and he ends up getting involved with the Underground Railroad and like this network of people who are helping with that. But again, it's infused with like magic and magical realism. And again, his writing is just so beautiful. And I don't know, both of his books so far have just been so touching and so moving, and I really highly recommend them. Okay, so that is it. Those are all of the books that I have read recently. I have been filming for so long. My voice is so tired. So I'm gonna go. I would love to hear from you in the comments though. Like, tell me what you've been reading, what you've been enjoying or not enjoying. I'm always down to hear your complaints. Or if you've read any of these books and if you have any thoughts on them, I would love to hear it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that I get to talk to you soon. Bye!